Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 19th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by John Markley online. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Great spring here day in St. Louis.
Oh, good. Yeah, the weather is getting much better. We have Manny Ortiz here.
Pleasure.
Welcome, Manny.
Thanks.
And John Hogoboom. Welcome back, John.
Again.
Back again.
Like a bad penny. I keep turning up.
And I'm Brian Rexroad. And well, we're going to start out today with a ransomware segment of the program. It's probably going to become sort of a routine part of this until we get a little bit of a better handle on this, and I mean that collectively as an industry. So, Manny, we'll start with you. And I guess this is a little bit of a good news story, right?
Yeah, a little bit. We'll see where the ending of this story goes, but we'll start off with it being good news. And as you said, we're, I think in the last couple of weeks, ransomware has been sort of a theme. So this one just has a little bit of a twist. So in this particular case, we're talking about this security researcher with a Twitter handle of Jack. Mm-hmm. He found this new ransomware called CryptoHost. Like in typical ransomware style, it demands 0.33 Bitcoins, which is actually a little bit on the lower end. I think it's usually about $300. This is about 140 US dollars. And it's usually seen bundled with a uTorrent installer. Mm-hmm. In this particular case, what makes it a little bit different is with typical ransomware, your data is actually encrypted. In this case, your data is actually not encrypted. It's actually just copied to a folder. It's actually a Windows roaming folder, and it's RAR'd, and the RAR file is actually password protected. So
that might explain why it's cheaper.
That might be. Encryption is very costly.
They outsource the encryption part, because I think RAR actually does encrypt it when you use a password. I don't know what but it's just their own whatever version.
Right. Yeah.
But you'd be able to crack it. It's a little different situation, perhaps.
Right.
Okay, so go ahead, Manny.
So in this particular case, the RAR file is actually password protected with a 41 character password. It's and it'll in a second we'll go over how they actually create the password. But it's actually being detected as two different things, as ransom, MSIL. I don't even know how to say if that's even sayable. It's a my name crypt.a and ransom cryptohost.a. Right. So again, the password, the thing about this one is that the researchers figured out how the password was actually created. So in this case, what they did was the password is actually created out of a couple of things. So what they did was the writer put the processor ID, the volume serial number, and the motherboard serial number with the dashes removed. So basically all of that slammed together with the current logged on username. So at the end, so you've got all of these basically characters put together, and then at the end you add in the actually currently logged in username, and that basically makes up the password, and that will unlock. So you just go find the file, which is actually located in that roaming folder, and this one actually, when the RAR program like 7-zip asks you for the password, that would be the password for it.
So do you know if anybody's coming out with basically automated undo it tool?
There are a couple tools. So the site where I saw this site had an actual tool which will actually go in and pull the password for you. So it actually just does the calculation for you, creates the password, so it's nice and easy for you to, so if you don't want to actually go do the calculations yourself, you can go and do that. And then there was a couple of steps to removing the malware itself, which is basically just stopping the CryptoHost executable process, deleting the file itself, and then removing it from the auto run. Which will basically remove it. And moving over to sort of the bad news on this is that, as we all know, the next iteration, which is probably going to be the B iteration of this, I'm sure they're going to fix this.
They're likely going to fix some aspect of this, that's true. Yeah. So the real answer is don't get infected in the first place. So any news about how this is being propagated typically?
So I think the way that they said was it was being done with a uTorrent installer. So any place that folks are downloading the actual uTorrent clients,
Right.
I'm assuming that's where they're getting it.
So, we haven't talked about that kind of thing. We're always talking about making sure you get your mobile apps from a reputable place.
Right.
We're always talking about, a lot of the cases, most of this ransomware that we've seen has been basically through spamming campaigns.
Yep.
And so, but you still have to pay attention to where you get your software for anything, quite
Exactly.
frankly. Right?
Yep.
I think one of the things about torrent is, uTorrent, these various clients, most of the people who are using it, I would say the majority of the traffic is probably not legitimate file sharing.
Yeah.
So they're already getting a tool to engage in something that's not quite legitimate. Usually,
Yeah.
that's not the primary.
I thought you were going to say they're probably a little more cognizant of the security concerns,
I
but
don't
perhaps not.
I think that's very unlikely.
Okay.
So, John, you're saying we shouldn't protect we don't need to worry about protecting the criminals. Is that what you're saying?
Perhaps it helps the folks that are running this ransomware, make them feel a little more comfortable with what they're doing, right?
I'm just saying, in any event, people who are engaged in a lot of BitTorrent typically are younger people sharing lots of videos or files or games or other software. So
That
they
might be
not
another
as
reason the ransom's a little bit lower, because they've done some market study on the financial
Right.
facilities of their clientele.
Right.
Clientele, I like that.
Okay, John, so
Yeah,
another
so
one.
this is just, and we don't have to go into a lot of detail on this one. This is kind of a follow-up or an update. I want to say maybe 2-3 weeks ago we covered this on the show. It's a variant of ransomware called Petya. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, but in any event, another ransomware variant. The one that kind of made this one a little bit interesting is that instead of encrypting the files on the system, it's actually encrypting the master boot record and the file allocation table. So it's a little bit more damaging. You can't even really get access to your hard drive because you don't even know where any of the files are actually stored on the hard disk. You could probably recover some of that with forensics and whatnot manually if you had to, but it's not something for the faint of heart. Some researcher came out, and I didn't really read the entire scheme of how he figured this out, but I guess there's some weakness in the encryption scheme that they used here. He has a web page you can go to, and if you do still have a disk that's encrypted with this, if you got hit with this ransomware and you still have it laying around, potentially this website could help you out by showing you what the actual encryption key is that was used. So it's kind of a brute force, it looks like, process that it uses to compute what the key is and figure out what the correct one was that was used. So
Okay, very cool. So this obviously somebody was motivated to figure this out.
Yeah, probably this guy got hit with it and said, I'm going to figure this out. And he did. So in any event, it seems like that's kind of the case we've seen. Like even the last one you talked about, not a particularly savvy scheme for key creation on that last one. This one maybe a little bit more savvy, but still had a weakness inherent in it. And then we talk about other ransomware where they actually will go out to a command and control to encrypt each individual file. That's a little bit even more advanced. That's why I think what we recommend normally is if you do get hit with ransomware, as soon as you figure it out, disconnect from the network, because that could stop that process of encrypting your files if it is one of those types.
Yeah, since you mentioned the cryptography aspect of this, or the key generation, I think it was just this, Bruce Schneier has a monthly blog. Do either if you follow that? I think a lot of folks do. He comes back from his background, dating way back when, is in cryptography, and he's always been saying that cryptography looks easy, but it really isn't. When you get right down to the nuts and bolts of it, the mathematics is only a piece of it. There are a lot of nuances around it, and the key management ultimately becomes a big part. And I remember Ed Amorosa in his quote, he was like, if you're in a meeting and you want to sound impressive, just say, all of this looks good, but the real challenge is key management. And people, everybody will agree with you. Anyway, I guess my one regret here is that each of these little successes associated with cracking the keys is just really going to make it, that much harder. That is, each iteration is going to become much more sophisticated. So we really have to be kind of focused on prevention of the infections in the first place, as opposed to the recovery from the infections.
Right.
All right, so John Markley, let's go to you. And there was some news that came out about bricking Apple devices, and perhaps you can put a little bit of reality around this and explain what's going on.
Yeah, let's shake some of the fear and uncertainty and doubt on this particular issue. A few weeks back, there was a big story about that. If you took an Apple device and set it back to January 1st, 1970, you'd actually brick it. It would be no use whatsoever. Y'all, I'm sure, remember that. And then Apple came back with, here's how to fix it. They actually even fixed or solve it. And they came out with a fix in upgrading to Apple iOS 9.3. Well, some researchers actually thought to themselves, well, what can I do to cause this same effort without having to actually physically get the device in my hand, right, and change that time on the device? And so they got to thinking about the NTP, the net time protocol. And is there a way to set up a NTP server on a local segment and force a device to change that clock back? And if it's not already updated to iOS 9.3, again, it would brick it if you forced it back to January 1st, 1970. So they came up with this idea, fairly theoretical. Of course, it requires to be on the same network segment. It requires an NTP server to be on that, to have a rogue NTP server on there to do man-in-the-middle type attacks. But theoretically, it is possible to force any device, really not just Apple, but any device back to a certain date.
Yep.
And they showed that if you hadn't upgraded it, you could brick your device if you weren't on the latest version of Apple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things you're sort of pointing out here is that there are some inherent, I'll call it authentication issues associated with NTP. I think to my knowledge, it's only recently that some work has been done on building in some authentication capability in NTP so that you'd be able to, as a part of the application, assure that you are talking to a time server that you're expecting to talk to. But I don't think that's in very wide use at this point, or even if the standard's even complete. I have not been tracking that specifically, but it definitely is something that's needed, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think it's been accepted, and part of the challenge, of course, is who has the time, and where does it come from, right? Where does it actually get set at? And in this particular issue, the good thing, at least, even the fact that Apple's got a patch, is that if you're on an LTE device, LTE actually gets their time from basically the cell tower. If you want to think about it that way, and so that's its first choice. And so even if you put up a rogue NTP, you'd actually have to put up a false base station. So not only would you have to put this fake NTP, you'd also have to do a false base station, which would only impact devices that were not LTE enabled, which is very few things nowadays.
I think I recall when we were discussing this, perhaps about a week ago, that you did make a pertinent point that even if this attack were successfully conducted, the only thing it can do is really brick the device. You can't steal any information. You can't really control the device. And so integrity and confidentiality aren't compromised. Well, in fact, confidentiality becomes somewhat permanent because whatever was on there gets destroyed. Right?
And they actually have solutions now that if it is bricked, you can get it back.
Oh, so that's even better.
It's not permanent.
All right, good.
So like I said, I got to thinking about time, and I wanted to kind of talk about time, because a few years back when I was a Unix admin, I was actually managing a lot of the NTP stuff on firewalls. And I got to thinking, well, what is these key elements of time? And, and a lot of people know about NTP. I know, Brian, you talk a lot about the attacks on, port 123, you see on denial of service. That's all NTP and clock sets. We see that a lot of traffic, and typically that's set, at least in the United States, I think it comes out of was it in Colorado, I think, is the master clock?
Yeah, NIST standard, there's I think it's a cesium clock, if it's still cesium. It could be a little bit, but
yeah.
Basically atomic derived time, yeah.
Yeah, and then, but for mobile, especially a lot of carriers, we actually use NITs, which is network identity and time zone. It's actually a different kind of standard. It doesn't have to be quite as down to the microsecond or picosecond. I don't even know how far it goes down to some systems. But it doesn't have to be that specific, but it does have to be accurate. And because it doesn't have to be global, it just has to be just for that tower, NITs works pretty well just being fairly close. Mm-hmm. There is some discussion as should cell providers go away from NITs, but it's still, that's kind of the standard we're at right now. And then another term that people like to talk about, like I said, this is the Unix background in my head, is epic time. And if you ever messed around with the actual Unix operating system, the source code, you'll see that it's all based on this number of seconds since Greenwich Mean Time, or UTC, however you want to call it, in January 1st, 1970. which we just talked about in Apple, that's a date that's seen as, matches the bricking issue with Apple. And that epoch time is real key in that, it is something that doesn't change. It's just a tick, 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 tick. Doesn't recognize leap seconds, which is where you have to come in with NTP to fix it. Unix and Unix-based systems do use it. And, if you think about the devices we have today, almost everything is Unix-based. I mean, just rattle off, a couple operating systems, a couple devices, and somewhere down at that core, there's a Unix.
Yeah, at least derived from Unix, right?
I mean, Android's there, your phones, some people would argue Microsoft Windows is Unix-based. It depends on how much of a Unix guy you are, gearhead. You could maybe argue that point. But the thing that I always laugh about is I have this date that I'm going to retire, and that has to be before January 19th, 2038. And because that is when epoch time runs out. So in the old Unix days, we had a signed integer, which was 32 bits long, and it runs out a number of digits on January 19th of 2038. And so if you have an older system that has not been updated to change that to 64 bits, time ends on that date. So that's the last day that I know I have to retire before that date. Because there's a lot of systems out there that are not going to have updated to 64-bit time.
Yeah, so what you're telling us is January 19th, 2038 is the new Y2K. Is that what you're...
Yes.
Do you remember the Y2K thing, John?
Yeah. And when I had Unix systems, I didn't really care too much about Y2K because it didn't bother me, right? And I was working Unix admin and 2000, and I didn't care because my systems ran great, but I know a lot of the other systems had problems. But this is it. This is the dead. This is the drop dead date. If you've not updated to newer operating system, newer kernel, this is it.
All right. Well, it's like you said, most have been updated, and hopefully that'll be the case as we go forward. I remember, the Y2K thing was a big concern. A lot of work went into it, and it turned out to not be that big a deal after all. Perhaps because a lot of work went into it. So I think some of the effort had already been put into correcting this problem. Hopefully it'll be a non-issue by the time 2038 rolls around.
Plus, all of us will probably be retired by then, right?
No, I'm going to be working still.
You're still going to be working?
I'm still going to be working, yeah.
I think I'll be retired.
Me too.
I'll be working on my retirement.
Yeah.
So next item here, John, we'll hand it over, John Hogoboom, we'll hand it over to you. And so we did a little bit of investigation and found some information about a botnet doing some denial of service attack activity, and you have the gory details.
Yeah, so there's this botnet composed of, and not surprisingly, a bunch of these closed-circuit television, DVR cameras, these OEM boxes anybody can get, and there's all these different versions of them out there. You go to any big box computer store, they have these 8-camera, 16-camera versions, 32, anyway. So Anyway, so there's a particular one, NetSurveillance. That's how it identifies itself. I think there's actually a more specific vendor involved here that's on top of that. But in any event, what we've kind of picked up is that on these devices, they're being compromised because they have a default password set. And there's 2 malware families getting dropped on there. There's a Linux backdoor FGT, which is a really popular DDoS piece of family malware. It's getting dropped in /dev DVRS helper, and that kind of is handling most of the DDoS C2 functions. However, there's another piece of malware also on. I don't know if it's 2 different actors or if it's the same person, but I think it might be the same actor. There's another malware piece that gets dropped that's Linux.Tsunami, which has a lot of the same functionality that the Linux backdoor FGT does, but they're primarily using that one to do all this 23 TCP telnet scanning and brute forcing. So that. So we see that in the we see that in the internet weather reports that you do at the end of the show, and probably these guys are contributing to that type of activity. I got a chart that kind of shows the distribution, which was interesting.
I presume that there's not really much of a patching process associated with these devices either.
Probably not, but I didn't really research it in depth. From my understanding, they usually don't. A lot of these things are coming out of China. They're very kind of low-end products. I don't think they get a lot of patching support. It's just kind of whatever you get when it ships is what you get.
Right.
And they're pretty low cost.
Yeah, I've had one for probably 4 or 5 years, and I have not had.
We've seen yours.
Have you seen it?
It's that little orange dot right over there.
Yeah, got it.
So this is a picture of just kind of geographic mapping of where most of these are from. And like I said, it is a very specific model that this botnet seems to be recruited from, which I thought was interesting. It seems that there's more density of this particular manufacturer's product in certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
So we notice Russia and Romania, a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries, I guess, like Bulgaria. I think there might have been Ukraine is in there, but then also Vietnam and Taiwan. So towards that, in the Europe, the big yellow mass in there is really kind of Romania, I think. And then I think over on the right in the Asia Pac, you have Taiwan and Vietnam in there, kind of accounting for a lot of those. But in the U.S., it's pretty sparse, except for Manny's showing up there. I'm just kidding. Brazil also in South America. So it's kind of interesting to see where the majority of them coming from. And from a strength, I also noticed, like in terms of how much power they're pushing out, DDoS power. The Russian and Romanian ones they seem to have really good bandwidth. I'm not sure why that is, but in any event, they seem to contribute more to some of these DDoS attacks that we've been seeing.
Good for them. They have good network service. That's good.
Apparently, yeah.
Okay, good. So let's go into some other aspects of the internet weather here, and looking at the last week or so. And surprise, surprise, there's scanning activity on port 23.
Right.
And a lot of it's associated with not necessarily just this botnet, but others that are doing.
But lots of other ones.
Lots of other ones. Followed by port 22 TCP, 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol, 445 TCP, 8080 TCP. That one moved up about 10 slots. Although we're going to take a look at the graph on a few of these, and you'll find that one's not all that impressively changed, but you'll see it. 443 TCP is next, followed by 25 TCP, 143 TCP. 143 is that the IMAP?
Yeah.
And then 1911 TCP, that's the one that we had associated with the industrial control activities as well.
Fox.
Right. Okay, so and then looking at the most sources doing the probing, port 23 has grown a little bit since last week. It hasn't really changed in ranking because it's at the top of the list by far in terms of ranking, but it has grown in terms of proportion of the activity that's taking place there. We'll take a closer look at that. You'll see why, or at least the parents of that and how much. Followed by 53413 UDP. That's that netis router backdoor. We'll take a look at that one and the progress associated with it. And then we have some ICMP in here also, which is pretty typical of the case. ICMP type 3, by the way, is basically a administratively denied, or basically you can't get there from here message. Followed by 445 TCP, 53 UDP, that being DNS. 8 ICMP is a ping request. 0 ICMP is a ping response, and so that's often used to be able to identify machines, perhaps even for exploit purposes, but there's a lot of that on the internet. You'll see that scanning around. Followed by 2816 ICMP. Well, actually, it's not 2816. That's actually another denied response message, which is actually ICMP type 11. And then 27015, we looked at that last week. That's associated with gaming activity and some interesting observations there. Nothing malicious associated with it. And then last but not least here, 4028 TCP, which remind me here, John, we're going to take a little look at that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a real rampant increase in scanning on it. The only thing we actually really have tied it to is older report on Light Hydra, which is another Internet of Things embedded device piece of malware for Linux, like these embedded Linux systems. Okay. So it might be related, but I don't know for sure. The jury's out.
Well, we'll take a little closer look at it, and I think it's been pretty standard as it's been going along here. So looking at scam probes as well as sources on port 23 TCP, I've combined the graphs here. The top graph is showing the number of probes, bottom graph showing the number of sources. You can see sort of a correlation over the last week or so here where there's been an increase in the number of sources and more of a ramped up increase in the number of probes that are taking place. But we're still not anywhere near where we've seen our peak at in the past. So for example, we're seeing on the order of about 100,000 sources in a given hour, maybe a bit 105 or so, whereas we have seen peaks up around 150, 160,000. And through the course of the day, that amounts to on the order of about 300,000 sources, give or take some. That's a pretty significant number. I mentioned earlier, Google had a report where they said they had identified about 768,000, I'm not sure I got the number exactly right, but they were infected websites. Now, if you consider the pervasiveness of websites, here we are on a given day seeing on the order of 300,000 infected devices that are scanning the internet on port 23, which you would think doesn't belong on the internet at all. So very, very strange things going on here. Next item, scan probes on port 3389 TCP. That's remote desktop protocol, by the way. This is obviously very spiky activity, and you can see that it's not an obvious upward trend here. It could be just that there was some spikes in activity in the recent days, so that would be the explanation for the prominence in the top 10 graph. And then the scan probes on port 8080 TCP. This is, really an alternative port for web traffic, often used for proxy traffic as well.
Administrative portals for various types of services, things
and,
like that.
There's always scanning activity on this one in the order of tens of millions per hour. There clearly is a little bit of a more significant density over the last few days, as well as an increase in the activity. So it doesn't look like this is a significant trend. It's just something that caused it to kick up a little bit relative to what we'd seen over the last week or so. And then looking at scan sources on port 53413, certainly down for what we've seen, and we're looking at 90 days of activity here. But over the last week or so, some increases in that activity. So oftentimes what will happen, perhaps not often, but what will happen in some cases is a botnet operator might get to a point where what I'd like to call saturation. They've recruited as many of the devices as they want to, or they need to, or they can, and then they'll relax the scanning activity. We've seen that over the last few weeks, and perhaps over time they start to lose those devices because they've been reset, or the owner noticed there was some kind of problem and they repowered the device and cleared out the malware, and they have to go back and recruit again. So that is perhaps what we're seeing in this increase of activity here. And then, as we just discussed, scan sources on port 4028 TCP. This is registered to dtserver, and I went down the path of sort of a conspiracy theory here. dtserver appears to be associated with basically a dynamic terrain server, which is basically for simulations. They use them for basically battlefield simulation type things. But I think it's the most likely the case that you described,
something
John.
else, because when we looked at the sources, it's a lot of these embedded devices again, similar to these DVR systems, home routers, network test storage, all those types of things. And it makes me think that light Hydra connection might be related in some way.
And that does make sense. And this is clearly botnet activity. We're looking at it in terms of the number of sources that are doing that scanning activity on the order of about 2,500 or so. And then when you look at the geographic distribution here, a little bit of a strange geographic distribution, in my opinion. We see some really heavy density in Iran, some in Cambodia. I don't recall Cambodia showing up in too many other cases. Some in the Philippines and some in Brazil as being the real concentration areas. I don't know how those particular countries were picked, but it seems like perhaps it was a deliberate choice by the botnet operator.
It's highly unusual. Like, we don't see a lot of scanning.
Not a lot of scanning.
We don't see much of
activity
anything
from
coming out of them, period.
Yeah.
So it is interesting.
So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq at list.att.com. You can find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube, as well as an audio podcast on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ATT Security. I'd like to thank you, John Markley, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John Hogoboom. Thank you, Manny. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.